So we've hidden away the details of the output in the previous video. Let's look at hiding away the details of the input. So, which is a bit more of a complicated task, right? We're not just printing out a string. In this, when we're asking the user for input, we ask them for some information. We tell them what we want, the first number or second number, and then we convert that to an integer, and then we want that integer to do a calculation. So here's a new function that does just that. Okay, notice it's just like our code before, because in the sense that it asks the user for their first number, takes that into a string variable, and then converts that string variable into an integer using int. Notice two functions being used in this inside this function, so input and int are both being used inside this function, and then we have to get that back to the program in some way. So we do return number one, and return takes the value that we've just calculated. We've turned it from a string into an integer and sends it back to the program where it was called from. So it's a function which prompts the user for the first number, converts it into a string from a string into an integer, and returns it back. And then there's another version of that. Input second int does exactly the same for the second number. Okay. Let me show you that code actually. So here we are. So here's the code. We got three functions now defined at the top. We've got input first int, input second int, and now the main program is this bit here, and that's starting to get a bit simpler. Okay. So in the main program, we can just say number one equals input first int, and this function does all the handling of that, right? And number two is input second int. The function does all the handling of that, asks the user for their input and converts that back into an integer. But because they're both returning a value, we need to store it somewhere, which is why, unlike the output function, now we've got number one equals to this whatever's returned by this function. So this function is returning something, we then have to store it somewhere, otherwise we can't use it. So we're storing the numbers that those two functions are returning in number one and number two respectively. Those are two integer variables. Okay, so let's just compare those functions we've created now. So as you saw, there's three of them there at the top of the program: input first int, input second int, and output. They're slightly different. The output has two parameters. I'll show you that. It's got two parameters, which are parameter 1 and parameter 2, and that's here. Okay, and doesn't return a value to the code it's invoked from. So there's no return statement there. You can see no return statement here, and so information is passed into the function but not out. Conversely, the other two functions, input first int and input second int, they've got no parameters. Nothing is passed into them. Okay, so there's no parameter here or here. Nothing's passed in, but they do return a value back to the code. So information for those functions is passed out of the function, but not in. So if you want information passed in, you have to have some parameters. If you want information passed out, you have to have a return. You can do both. We'll see that in a minute. Okay, so, and because of what is passed back to the invoking code, because we are passing something back, in the case of the input ones, they would be known as functions, and the output would be known as a subroutine because it doesn't pass anything back. But in Python, they might be referred to as methods. Both of them might be referred to as methods. In Python, everything is a function. So if you come across those names, function, subroutine, method, they do have specific meanings for certain languages, but in Python we call everything a function, pretty much. Okay, now there's a way of simplifying this code. I wonder if you spotted it, which is that it's a bit overcomplicated in the sense that, look, we're looking, as I mentioned before, we're looking for duplication. We want to get rid of duplication, and these are essentially, look at them, they're essentially doing the same thing. They just ask the user for something different. So, but essentially, and they store the values in a different variable, but that doesn't really matter. They're essentially asking the user for something, reading in a string, converting that string to a number, and returning that number. So if instead of doing it like this, if we passed in that string first number and second number as a parameter into these functions, we'd only need one function. So the next example, example 6, just prompts the user for a value which is converted to an integer and then returned. Okay, so when we call this function, we pass in the prompt, which might be first number, might be second number, it could be something else entirely. This code prints out that prompt in the input function, and whatever the user types in is stored in the string, and then it takes the string and converts that into a number and returns that number. So our invoking code is now nice and simple. Number one, we just use this input int function and we say first number, or number two, input int second number, and now we've simplified the code quite considerably. If I show you the actual program, here it is. We've only got two functions at the top now. We've got input int and we've got output, and here we're using input int in two different ways by passing in different prompts to the user, and then taking whatever the function returns and storing it in number one and number two. Okay, so let's stop that video there, and then we'll see how to replace other bits of the code in a second.